The ultimate gold standard of Bitcoin self-custody, this opportunity to split up keys and to create a threshold where more than one secret is required to access your money, is a nightmare for governments that might eventually seek to seize people's Bitcoin. It does make me nervous. The more Bitcoin gets tied into the conventional financial system, it puts a check on some of these rehypothecation schemes. The juice is absolutely worth the squeeze for the power that you get out of a multi-sig wallet. No great power comes without responsibility. The most easily accessible starting point for most people is a custodial Lightning wallet on your phone.
What's your most important reason to take control of your own Bitcoin? What's the reason that stands out for you why to take them off exchange and take your Bitcoin in self-custody in your own control?
My thinking is that it's the whole point of Bitcoin, and taking personal custody of your Bitcoin and your private keys facilitates all of these other potential use cases of Bitcoin that make it more useful. Primarily, my concern, the most important feature of Bitcoin to me is the supply cap. And in our world that in some senses is over-financialized, if more people take personal custody of their private keys, that leaves less Bitcoin on exchanges and out in the open market that could potentially be claimed multiple times by some of these financial entities that want to either loan it out multiple times or rehypothecate it in other ways. So that is, I think, the most important reason to take self-custody. However, the seizure resistance of Bitcoin is also, obviously heavily tied up in holding your own keys, and privacy-focused use of Bitcoin is only possible really if you hold your own keys. And the censorship-resistant aspect of Bitcoin also only possible really if you hold your own keys, because if someone else is holding the Bitcoin for you and sending it when you want to send it to who you want to send it to, they can also tell you how much you can send or how little you are allowed to send, or who you're allowed to send to, or who you're not allowed to send to. So there's so many aspects of the freedom aspect of Bitcoin that are tied up also in holding your own private keys.
Yeah, and especially on an individual level, when you don't hold your own keys, you get 1 out of 20 attributes from Bitcoin. You get the number go up technology if you're lucky and they don't get stolen, stuff like that. But everything else you're losing on. And it's also interesting, you mentioned it with self-custody, and more and more Bitcoin should be in personal custody and not with big exchanges, even with the Bitcoin ETF. Do you see a danger where in 2 years, 5 years, where a lot of pension funds, a lot of big companies buy with Bitcoin ETFs, with BlackRock, with all the Bitcoin ETF issuers, that they just do the thing that FTX tried?
Yeah, it is a concern. And what comes to mind is, I don't remember if it was on a podcast or a tweet that I heard this, but the importance of Bitcoin as collateral comes into play. And I do believe that Bitcoin is this perfect kind of collateral that is very easy to quickly liquidate, which is what makes it the perfect collateral. Collateral is because Bitcoin markets are very, very wide, very deep, and they operate 24/7 every day out of the year. So if someone defaults on a loan and the collateral on the loan needs to be liquidated, lenders can have confidence that they can liquidate it at the price that they need to. Now, what I heard, again, I can't say where, but someone told me that it was going to be very important over time that these ETFs can serve as a collateral source for people who want to do other things financially to borrow against. That, I think, opens the door for what I think your question is about, which is, so if the Bitcoin are being held in an ETF, and I think we can have a relatively high degree of confidence that a share of Bitcoin in the ETF likely is backed by the actual Bitcoin itself, but it then falls upon the issuer of the shares. How many times are they going to allow those shares to be lent out, more than once by more than it just opens up the possibility for all these, reindeer games that unfortunately unwind in these leverage events and liquidation events. So it does make me nervous. I think that was your original question. It does make me nervous the more Bitcoin gets tied into the conventional financial system, but that's why we're out here preaching the gospel of self-custody too, I guess.
Does it make you nervous for short to medium term, but also long term? Like if you look at like 50 years, a lot of Bitcoin is like, oh, no matter what they do on Bitcoin and Bitcoin ETFs, it does not matter. Bitcoin does not care long term. Obviously, everybody, I think, agrees on the short term risk when they try to stuff like that. Like even with gold, they tried to they confiscated that, but still gold remained valuable over a long period of time. So like, do you see very long term also a risk to that, or is it more like medium term risk?
I think in the long term, the risk resolves itself, but I do have some thoughts on your comment that gold retained value over time, which you're absolutely correct that it did retain value over time, but because of gold's flaws in terms of it's expensive to custody, it's difficult to move around, and it's also somewhat difficult to assay or confirm that what you're holding is 100% actual gold. Because of gold's shortcomings, I think to a certain degree, gold was captured and tamed by the larger financial system, because people who own gold, people who own claims to gold and gold, I guess you could say only a small percentage of those people have gold actually in their safe at home or in their mom's attic or buried under a tree somewhere. Most of the people who have financial exposure to gold and who you could call gold investors hold some sort of either financial instrument like the gold ETF, or they hold a share or a claim to gold in one of these companies that custodies gold on other people's behalf. And there may be some redeemability there in terms of if you green light them sending your gold to you. Most of those companies will probably do that. But in the larger context, I think gold has been financially tamed to the degree that it doesn't currently really tell the truth about inflation, because that's really the test of whether or not something is a scarce asset, is when the number of dollars or euros or whatever other fiat denomination you want to choose, when the denominator goes up, when they pump currency into the market, the value of scarce assets in that currency should go up if all things are equal. And gold has despite the amount of dollars that have been being pumped into the global financial system, gold hasn't moved yet. I don't follow it closely. I think it's starting to move a little bit, but gold hasn't really responded. So I think gold has been tamed somewhat. In terms of Bitcoin, I think in the long term, these incentives work themselves out, because people can only touch the stove so many times before they decide that it's not a good idea to touch the stove. So it may take some pain, and it may take some of these fraud and liquidation events where certain parties get over levered or Bitcoin gets loaned out multiple times. But the beauty of Bitcoin is that it can be held in a secure way, either at the institutional level, at the corporate level, at the church level, at the business level. That is truly one of the democratizing things about Bitcoin, is that it is extremely inexpensive and reasonably simple to custody it yourself if you're motivated to do so that you can be sure that you own the Bitcoin that you believe you own, and be sure that it is not a claim on Bitcoin, it is authentic UTXO on the network. I don't want to get too technical, but I think I answered your original question. I think in the long term, after enough of these scams are exposed, it becomes important for entities at all levels to hold their own keys, and it puts a check on some of these rehypothecation schemes.
100% brings the true price discovery back to the free market. And when we now go forward, and like for myself, I needed 1 solid year from having self custody to even knowing what multi-signature is. Like I had self custody for a year, and I did not know what multi-sig is for a solid year. And I think still, when you make a poll from like all the Bitcoiners, you would have a crazy amount of people, even from those who have self-custody, who don't know or could describe what is multi-signature. Like, can you quickly summarize what it is, and more importantly, why multi-signature is so important?
And there's a lot of misconceptions about multi-signature out there too. And the various aspects of its fault tolerance and the information you have to store. But just at its root, a multi-signature Bitcoin wallet is a wallet that has been created using at least 2 private keys. Most commonly, it's either 3 or 5. And those private keys are combined to create a new, we'll call it a secret, that is what secures your Bitcoin. The person setting up the multi-sig wallet gets to decide the threshold of whether you need 2 of 2 keys to be able to spend the money, or if you need 2 of 3 keys or 3 of 5. It's bake your own cake. Users get to decide, but it is a way of taking the secrets that protect your Bitcoin and breaking them up and introducing some fault tolerance. Ideally, that's the value for me, is the fault tolerance. And what I will also mention, my background is in law enforcement. I was a digital forensic examiner in a law enforcement context for 12 years. I don't say that publicly as a Bitcoiner because I know it's going to make me the most popular guy, but I have some unique perspectives about the relationship of Bitcoin to government, and governments being able to seize or not seize certain assets. And multi-signature wallets were a huge light bulb moment for me as an asymmetric advantage to the defender to protect against other people, either private parties, thieves stealing their Bitcoin, or, pardon me, in a little bit bigger situation, authorities, government entities trying to seize Bitcoin. As a part of my work duties, I would occasionally help execute search warrants. And this means going into people's houses and looking through drawers and under mattresses and behind books and all that kind of thing for items that are sought by a government entity because they believe they were involved in a crime and have evidence to prove that a crime occurred. And so part of what government also does is seize financial assets. And I think all good Bitcoiners have this natural suspicion of government, because all throughout history, as governments consolidate power, it is inevitable that they are ultimately tempted to abuse that power, and innocent people who are freedom lovers, unfortunately, eventually seem to end up being hurt by that that consolidation of government power. And so, as someone who's going into a private residence with a warrant, and a warrant is just a list of things that you're allowed to take and why you're allowed to take them. If a government wants to seize your Bitcoin and you are storing it in a multi-signature fashion with keys geographically separated, this, in practical terms, presents a nightmare for the people who are tasked with trying to take your money, because they may find a private key that you keep in your house, whether it's stored in a hardware wallet or a card that's a wallet backup as a list of words. But just because they find that one private key, they don't necessarily know how many private keys that may be protecting your Bitcoin, or where those keys may be hidden, unless they can develop specific information from you or other investigative sources about how you're custodying your Bitcoin and what is required to access it. It is a literal nightmare, because those private keys could be held in a safe deposit box. They could be held in your grandparents' basement. They could be held in a close friend's gun safe. They could be on the far side of the world, and all you need is an internet connection to be able to access them with the help of a trusted person somewhere else in the world. So this opportunity to split up keys and to create a threshold where more than one secret is required to access your money is a nightmare for governments that might eventually seek to seize people's Bitcoin. And that power was extremely apparent to me as someone who has been the person going into someone else's home looking for information or items. So that was the light bulb moment from Multi-Sig for me. Now, it also has some other tremendous advantages in terms of, like, we're humans. We forget things, we lose things. It's just a natural part of being human. And the other important part is not just this asymmetric advantage against adversaries, but it also protects you from yourself to some degree. So if you think it's a good idea to memorize a private key and you're unfortunately involved in a car accident, or you just outright forget it, because I never advocate for this, but there are people out there who memorize seed phrases and think that is the best way to protect their money. Multi-sig provides this sort of backstop to where it puts you in a position where you can lose a secret, or you can have a secret destroyed by fire or flood or some other natural disaster, and you don't necessarily have to lose access to your funds. So that's the other powerful aspect that I personally see in Multi-Sig. The flip side of the coin is that no great power comes without responsibility. And so there's trade-offs in everything. And storing Bitcoin in a multi-sig wallet requires a little bit of additional information keeping and learning on the behalf of the person doing it, but it's not insurmountable. And I think the trade-offs still land in favor of multi-sig being a better solution for more people than is what is commonly believed.
Yeah. You also quickly talked about the misconceptions that you see with multi-signatures. Do you, like, what misconceptions do you see there? Like, do you see, like, what do people and also Bitcoiners think about Bitcoin multi-signature? What's not true?
Right. So with it's like all good FUD. There's a little bit of truth mixed in with lies. And so what people will tell you with Bitcoin, you have private keys, and that is the ultimate secret that you need to safeguard to protect your Bitcoin. But each private key has a public version, which is aptly named a public key. And when you set up that Bitcoin wallet, you combine these public keys to create the wallet that helps you track a balance and be able to generate receive addresses and to manage that wallet over time. You have to have all of those public keys to be able to have access to the wallet and spend the Bitcoin. If you lose one of those public keys, it's game over. That said, it is extremely easy to safeguard those public keys because they are private information, not secret information like the private keys. That's a little bit of word salad there. So let's just say that I use Sparrow, which is a common wallet coordinator, or I use Blue Wallet, which is a common mobile coordinator, to set up a multi-sig wallet. Within the files associated with that wallet that are stored on your computer are all of the public keys that are necessary to spend the money. And as long as that computer doesn't become corrupted, the phone gets lost or destroyed, the hard drive crashes, whatever it is, as long as you continue to have access to that wallet, this whole issue of losing access to your private keys isn't an issue. However, because digital devices fail, and because humans make mistakes, and because accidents happen, you want to keep some sort of analog backup of not just your private keys, but the public keys as well. But because these are private but not secret information, meaning that if someone got access to these public keys, all they can do is see your Bitcoin balance and see the transactions that you've made that are associated with that wallet. They can't take any of your money or steal anything. They can just, so it's a privacy concern. Because it's a privacy concern and not a steal your money concern, in my humble view, it's okay to take those public keys, which are commonly packaged in the form of what's called a wallet descriptor. All the wallets have this particular format: Sparrow, Spectre, Blue Wallet, Nunchuck, Keeper. I don't want to leave any of the ones out, especially the ones that are compatible with SeedSigner. All of these wallets take those public keys and package them into a wallet descriptor. What this wallet descriptor is in addition to your private keys, it's a little bit of basic information about the configuration of the wallet, the number of keys that are required, what threshold of keys are required, that kind of thing. And they will give it to you in a format that is easy to store either in a digital or an analog format. It's either a file that you can encrypt and store in the cloud. I've heard of people putting their wallet descriptor in a password manager. I personally print out the wallet descriptor and keep it with each one of my private keys, because that way, as long as I have access to the private keys, I have access to a backup of this wallet descriptor. So that I think is the primary misconception about multi-signature wallets, is that you commonly refer to as a multi-signature wallet as a 2 of 3. So you have to have 2 private keys. And then people, for whatever reason, who are skeptical about multi-signature wallets will jump in and say, aha, but in addition to the 2 of 3 private keys, you also have to have all of the public keys. And what kind of additional information storage burden is that puts on users? So there is some additional storage keeping information storage requirement, but I don't think it's unreasonable. And in my opinion, the juice is absolutely worth the squeeze for the power that you get out of a multi-sig wallet.
Yeah, definitely. And like whenever I talk with Bitcoiners about self-custody and even multi-sig, I have this one friend in mind who is 100% in Bitcoin. Like, this is an actual friend of mine.
Mm-hmm.
And
God bless him.
He is unfortunately, and I'm trying to convince him every time I meet him, to be not as lazy as he is with his self-custody solution, because he has none. Like, he keeps it on the exchange. And he even lost money to a certain extent through Celsius. And even that did not wake him up, unfortunately. What would you recommend to people that are that understand Bitcoin? I think people that really understand Bitcoin have self-custody, but that's another topic. But what do you recommend to people that have Bitcoin, still have it on the exchange, are lazy, don't want to do the work, or don't have time to do the work? I think you should take the time, but that's also another discussion. What would you recommend for like the lowest entry, the less amount of time? What would you recommend those people? Is SeedSigner also like a solution for them?
I think we think about it in terms of a hierarchy of independent Bitcoin custody, because everyone has to start from somewhere. And probably the most easily accessible starting point for most people is a custodial Lightning wallet on your phone. And you can quickly and easily receive sats. You can quickly and easily send sats. There's relatively low fees associated with that. And obviously you have this custody risk where if the company folds, or for whatever reason they decide that you don't have the money that you think you have on their platform, they can take it. I would be curious to know about your friends. Is it truly a laziness thing? And I don't like using the word laziness, but maybe he's just an extremely efficient person and he doesn't believe that the effort expended he would get, the value out of the effort expended.
He has a lot of trust still, like a lot of trust in governments. He even works for a political party in the parliament, and so he trusts the system. Mm-hmm. But still, he gets Bitcoin as a store of value, as something that will rise over time. So right. I think that's where he trusts a third party, because he has trust in the system guarding his Bitcoin.
Right. And it's degrees of trust. In my opinion, like there's, if you just purchase an off-the-shelf hardware wallet and you use, like Ledger has Ledger Live, Trezor has Trezor Suite, Foundation Devices has Passport Envoy. If you go to a hardware wallet manufacturer's website give your name and payment information, have it shipped to your home address, and then you use their wallet coordinator, there is still honestly trust tied up in that situation. It's definitely not as much as, if you have your Bitcoin on Coinbase, but that's another thing I tell people these days is that there is still trust tied up in that situation. And that trust may be more nuanced and not entirely have everything to do with them taking your money, but you're subject to other risks that are still not insignificant, I would say. But back to your friend. The next step for him is obviously to look at hardware wallet companies and to find the one that he thinks has a reputation that he likes and is trustworthy, and to take whatever coins he has on whatever centralized exchange that he's using to move them off. That's his next step. SeedSigner probably isn't his first stop in terms of his independent Bitcoin custody journey, and that's okay. But the idea, as I get back to it, is this step ladder of self-custody. And again, the Lightning wallet is at the top, and then there's an on-chain custodial Bitcoin exchange, and then there's maybe a hot wallet on your phone where you're holding the keys, but you haven't backed them up. And there's obviously some elevated risk carrying around your private keys in your phone. Now let's get those keys that are in what most Bitcoiners refer to as a hot wallet. Let's get those keys offline and make a new setup that is a cold wallet. And that's probably the stepping stone that you'd like him to be at, where his keys are offline and he is personally taking responsibility for holding them. The next rung of the ladder, I would say, is multi-sig. And there are some different ways you can do multi-sig. The ultimate gold standard of Bitcoin self-custody, in my mind, and I'll throw a shout out to a guy called Michael Flaxman, who wrote a document called, I believe it's called the 10x Bitcoin Security Guide, which was one of my light bulb moments in my personal self-custody journey. It's hosted on GitHub. If you put, Bitcoin 10x Security Guide into an internet search, you should be able to find it pretty easily. The absolute pinnacle of Bitcoin security is a multi-sig wallet, and each of the different keys in the wallet quorum are represented by a different hardware profile with a different manufacturer and a different code base that drives that hardware, a different security model. Now, is there something in between those two? I think in the self-custody journey, I think SeedSigner is this really unique position between your single-sig hardware wallet and the absolute pinnacle of security that is, we'll say, 5 different hardware wallets that have all been combined to create this diverse multi-sig hardware wallet. With a SeedSigner, one of our unique characteristics is that the device is engineered to be amnesiac or stateless, but what that means in normal people terms is that it's engineered not to store your private key. So when you unplug the device, any private key that you've been working with, there's not information stored on that. And when you power the device back on, it doesn't know anything about keys you've used or transactions that you've made previously, and you have to give it whatever private key or keys that you want to use. In the context of multi-sig, this opens up some interesting possibilities, because if you're comfortable with the security model that makes up a stateless device, you can use that one device to manage multiple keys in a quorum. Because at the pinnacle of security, that again is this, you have a cold card, you have a Trezor, you have, God forbid, a ledger, you have a BitBox, and then maybe you have a SeedSigner. Those are 5 different devices with 5 different user interfaces and 5 different firmware updates that you have to deal with. And for the layperson, that's really a lot to manage. In addition to having, if you have, this is kind of a side note, but if you have a key stored on your Trezor, we'll say, that digital copy of that key probably needs to be have an analog backup somewhere. So for each of those hardware wallets that remember and store your private key, you really should keep an analog backup. So anyhow, back to SeedSigner. Because it does not persistently store your private keys, it's this unique device that you can use to manage multiple private keys in the context of a multi-sig wallet, or even used to manage multiple single signature wallets. If you want to have, if you're an Uncle Jim and you want to help other people have a single sig Bitcoin wallet, or if you want to have a separate wallet that you spend from more frequently that is aside from your multi-sig kind of long-term savings. I'm admittedly frugal or a cheapskate, and I didn't want to have to spend probably $500 to $1,000 to be able to just figure out if multi-sig was something that made sense to me, and if it was a long-term cold storage solution that I was comfortable with personally. So I initially came across a DIY device called Spectre DIY that is a great Bitcoin cold storage tool that introduced me to this idea of a stateless device that doesn't remember your private keys after it's been unplugged or it's been powered down. And it's a bit of a story in terms of how SeedSigner flowed from that, but that was another one of these light bulb moments for me. And it's appealing to me to only have that one device that you have to worry about, rather than, as I said, having multiple devices with private keys on them being stored in different places and all with their own firmware updates they're probably going to bother you about. And it's a viable alternative to me to use one device, whether it be a SeedSigner, or there are other hardware wallets that now have introduced this concept of statelessness or ephemerality that can be used to also manage a multi-sig quorum. I'd like to think that our project was the one that showed the value in that, and after we, with an enthusiastic user base, kind of demonstrated that it was a viable model for managing private keys, I think first Jade came in and introduced what I think they call QR mode, which is where you can power on the device in an alternate operating mode where it works very similar to a SeedSigner. You have to give it a private key before you can do anything with it, and then when you power it off, it forgets the private key. Cold Card Off also offers what's they refer to as an ephemeral mode, which is the exact same thing. While it's on, you give it a private key in a special operating mode, and then when you power it off, there's no trace of that key being stored. I think this is a model we're going to see become more popular over time and as more people adopt multi-sig, because it makes sense and it diminishes the number of things you have to find hiding places for.
Yeah, that's great, and I think now we can.
I warned you that I could talk a lot if you just let me run. So
I love it. I actually have one episode I released it like a week ago, and he is the guy. He's called Robin4Days, and he's on a mission to write Bitcoin down 21 million times, which is, I think, crazy. And he's at, I think, 200,000 or 300,000 now, where he wrote Bitcoin down on paper, actual paper. And I was writing him, hey, I just want to know why, and ask you the question why on my podcast. And this is exactly what I did. I asked him, why are you doing that? And he went on, and 55 minutes later, I asked the second question.
I love it. Like some people think a lot and their heads are full of ideas.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. I also had, I think, 2 days ago, Guy Swan on, and he's also like full of ideas, very deep thinker of Bitcoin, and I loved the interview with him.
Can you give me the just as a matter of my own personal curiosity, the TLDR on the writing Bitcoin 1 million times or 21 million times? What's the what is the value he sees in going through that process?
21 Bitcoin is Bitcoin only from day one, and they teach and preach self-custody. This is my go-to exchange when someone asks me, oh, where can I buy my Bitcoin from? This is the easiest entry for Bitcoiners. And if you want lower fees, plus at the same time support this podcast, use code Robin and click the link in the description. His value was, he compared it a little bit with Mr. Beast. He wants to do something crazy. Definitely. Like he is the person that wants to do something that nobody else does. And he was inspired, I think, by Mr. Beast. He's in the early days of Mr. Beast, he just made videos where he said some word 10,000 times or something like that. It was not as crazy with 24 million times, but it was similar to that. And then we talked a lot, like he talked a lot, like I should not say we. I was not in that conversation actually, but but he talked a lot about motivation and mindset and doing stuff that is just completely outside of the thing. And he also talked about how in the first 100,000 words nobody cared. With the 100 to 200,000 like slowly podcast interviews and stuff like that happened. And I suggested him, honestly, while you're writing, stream it and talk about Bitcoin. This could be a really popular stream. And then you'd actually do something like with the community, because people suggested even that in the comment section, like, do you live stream it? Where can I watch it? Like, I'm like, why do you want to watch that? First of all, but people seem to like to watch it. So I think he wants to do something crazy, and it's a nice episode.
It makes me wonder if there's not some sort of potentially like meditative aspect to it, where
definitely. We went into that.
You always imagine the Tibetan monks that repeat a single word over and over again.
And actually, this was my first question after he talked 50 minutes. Like, is there a meditative thing? Because I like to walk. Like, I usually like walk at least 30 minutes every day, usually in the morning. Awesome. If I get to that. And it's a wonderful thing to do. And I recommend everybody like walk more outside in the sun. It's amazing. And I asked him that, and he said yes and no, because yes, of course, you get better in writing. Like, writing Bitcoin becomes really easy for time, but he also does a lot with fonts and different styles of writing and have different patterns in there. So he also tries to figure out like, and he's like also concerned that people are like, oh, you're just copying, like you wrote it like 10,000 times and you just copy, like. That's why he wants to try patterns in there. And I think it would be also interesting to see, like, have papers in there, like in art museums and where Bitcoin is like represented and stuff like that. Yeah. So I think he can do a lot with that. And it was an interesting talk, but it was more about motivation and mindset and less about the actual thing, writing down Bitcoin.
Interesting.
But let's. This is a great go into now the next question. Like, why did you start with SeedSigner, or were you the person that started SeedSigner? Like, how did SeedSigner started? And like, it's a very community-driven product. It's open source. It's not the normal company that, like, as you mentioned, BitBox, like how are they called, Swift Crypto or something like that, is how is the organization also with SeedSigner?
Like many things in life, they begin with mistakes and humiliation. So I don't want to go too deep, because I could talk for a long time about my Bitcoin rabbit hole story, but just to give you a abbreviated version of that. So I mentioned that I was a law enforcement officer for a significant portion of my life. I am no longer. But back in 2013, I heard about Bitcoin at work, and it was in the context of an investigation at work. And some, a kid who was mining Bitcoin and buying weed on the Silk Road and then selling the marijuana at school to other kids. And of course, the teachers figure out what he's doing and they call the police, and his computer ends up in our forensic lab, and we're tasked with figuring out if there's evidence of a crime on it. So that was the first context for Bitcoin in my life. And at that point, I was a young man with a young family and a big mortgage, and I was looking for investments and ideas that I could use to make money to lessen the financial burden on myself and my wife for our family. And so the first lens that I viewed Bitcoin through was kind of as an investment. And so I started learning and being active on Bitcoin Talk, and eventually Reddit became more popular, and then into Twitter. But I initially started paying attention to Bitcoin in 2013. when the price was going up, which is probably the exact wrong time to start paying attention to Bitcoin, because you think the price is going to go up forever. And of course, Mt. Gox happened in early 2014, and there was this long bear market between 2014, 2015, and into 2016. And the price started to rise in 2016, and I'd just been through this long sort of emotionally difficult journey of holding the Bitcoin, being convinced it was going to increase in price again because I'd spent so much time learning about the technology and the community that was building things on it. And in early 2017, as the price continued to rise, Bitcoin got to the point where if I sold every single Satoshi that I had, I could legitimately pay the taxes on what I would own on the gain, because the government wants that. And then I would be able to pay off the mortgage on our house. And my wife and I could have essentially a new start with a debt-free life, to where the money we make could be our own and we wouldn't have to service any loans on a house or cars or anything like that. So that was a very emotional moment for me. And I had a weak hands event early in 2017. Don't be jealous of me because I didn't time the market well. I sold everything probably at 2,200. But the dream came true, and we were in fact able to pay off our mortgage, which paved the way for me to exit my career a few years later. And over the next 6 months after I sold the Bitcoin, the price kept going up and up and up. And of course, so I didn't want to hear about Bitcoin or think about Bitcoin or ponder, my poor timing in the market or my poor sense of what the price direction was going to do, or my lack of faith or anything like that. And that's the mistake and humiliation part. And so in 2018, after I'd spent a long time trying not to think about Bitcoin, the price crashed after the 2017 high, which I think was around $20,000, and it came back down and sometime in 2018 to around $4,000 or $5,000 at its low. And for whatever reason, I started thinking about Bitcoin again, and I started following it, and I started reading on Twitter and listening to podcasts again. And I started thinking, does my personal story, instead of this being in some ways a sad story, I mean, I'm still absolutely blessed to be able to experience that financial gain and translated it into a debt-free life. Absolutely blessed for that. But the regret and pain that I feel for no longer holding the Bitcoin that I once held, is that going to be the end of the story, or is that possibly the beginning of a new story? So as I was transitioning out of my career in law enforcement and digital forensics, I started buying more Bitcoin, and I'm buying it at the highest prices I've ever paid for Bitcoin, knowing that I will ultimately own much less Bitcoin than I did before, because everybody gets Bitcoin at the price that they deserve, and that's just, you have to be humble and admit that. And as I'm accumulating more Bitcoin, I start to think about the day that I sold my original stash and the time leading up to that. And I, over time, came to the conclusion that while I had given thought to my cold storage setup, and in some ways it was a great setup that I had put time and care into, I think some kind of anxiety about that value partly drove my selling the Bitcoin. And people who have not experienced a financial gain like that, I come from generally a working class family. My dad worked at a Ford dealership behind the parts counter for all of his working years. My mom went back to college and later in life became a software developer in her 40s and 50s. Totally, absolute respect to her for that. But I came from a very middle-class environment, and people that don't have that kind of money and haven't experienced an investment that has gone up 500, 1,000, 10,000%, they're just not mentally equipped for that. It's like when you hear about people who win the lottery and come into $10 million and you follow up on them 3 or 4 years later and they're back living in a studio apartment and they don't really have anything to show for the money that came through their hands or what happened. Like normal people just aren't equipped for those kind of financial gains. And so that was definitely a part of it. But as you start to think about, the value you're holding and stuff, and I had used a Bitcoin cold storage tool called bitaddress.org. That was a website. A lot of people hear a website, oh my gosh, what kind of crazy thing did you do? But bitaddress.org was hosted online, but it was this website where you could create private keys, and it had different ways to print out those private keys or split them into some kind of Shamir secret sharing setup or whatnot. But the beautiful thing was that that website was open source. The code that underlied the website was available on GitHub for people to audit and download independently of the website. And what you could do was, and this is a little bit of where my background in forensics comes in, you could say take your laptop computer, instead of booting it to Windows or Mac OS or whatever your usual operating environment is, you could boot it to a different operating environment that was, say, a Linux live CD or maybe Tails OS, one of these more secure ephemeral operating systems. And you could load the code that made up that website, bitaddress.org, into this separate computing environment that wasn't connected to the internet and that wasn't going to store information beyond that operating system session. And you could open the website and still do everything that you would be able to do with a website online. So what I did was I bought a simple USB connected printer that didn't have any sort of wireless functionality. I booted my laptop into a live Linux environment that only existed in RAM, such that when you turn off the computer, there's not any record kept of what you did on the computer while it was powered on. And I loaded a copy of this website into that Linux Live environment. I connected the USB printer, and I printed out several public-private key pairs that, after the fact, I used to deposit Bitcoin to. And then I put the printer in my basement, and I never used it again. And I put that piece of paper that I printed out in my underwear drawer, and that was my Bitcoin savings. Now, mind you, this was I'm not a whale, and I was never a huge holder of Bitcoin, so it was in the beginning a matter of several $100s or several $1,000s, and over time, as the Bitcoin price recovered, it grew, and that was the genesis for my anxiety. I can already sense I'm starting to digress, so I'm going to fast forward to the future. As I started reaccumulating Bitcoin, I thought about, given my background in digital forensics with some information security sprinkled in, what is the way of holding Bitcoin that would make the most sense to me and give me the most peace of mind, so that, if Bitcoin keeps going up, if I continue to save with it and the value goes up, how can I minimize that security concern of the Bitcoin somehow being lost or stolen, and have that be less of a concern or not a concern? And that's when I encountered Michael Flaxman's 10x Bitcoin Security Guide, which gave me a lot of perspective. And he's a really smart guy, and has done a lot of research. I first heard him talk on Stefan Libera's podcast, and Michael Flaxman made reference to Spectre Desktop, which was a relatively new software wallet at the time, and their focus was on multi-signature Bitcoin storage. They also had a DIY wallet project that allowed you to build your own wallet or signing device or whatever you want to call it. And so the 10x Bitcoin Security Guide really resonated with me. I had a little bit of a technical background, so I built a Spectre DIY, and I downloaded Spectre Desktop and started becoming more familiar with it. And I thought it was very compelling the way that they broke down the Bitcoin storage and spending process, in that you have your laptop computer where Spectre Desktop is installed. that obviously has to connect to your node or some sort of other block information source so that you can interact with the Bitcoin network, so that you can track a Bitcoin balance over time, and so that you can broadcast transactions to spend Bitcoin, when you choose to do that. But the device that interacts with your private keys, which is the security critical aspect of your Bitcoin wallet, it was a separate device. It was the Spectre DIY device. And the way that those two devices communicated was through QR codes. By virtue of my forensic background, it always made me uncomfortable to plug a hardware wallet into a laptop computer, because if you can use that USB connection to update the firmware, just about anything can happen with that device if you're perhaps tricked into giving it the wrong update, or there's some sort of malicious software on your computer. So I just never liked that. And so this process of using QR codes to move what are essentially cryptographic signatures back and forth from the device that talks to your private keys and then the other device that talks to the Bitcoin network, it's this wonderfully constrained protocol that dramatically limits the amount of information that can move between the two devices and makes it much more difficult to compromise or impact that device that is dealing with your private keys. That was a revelation to me. The first time I signed a transaction with Spectre desktop, it was like the first time I'd sent a Bitcoin transaction, or the first time that I'd used Lightning. It was just this magical, I just authorized a spend of money with a separate device that has no physical connection to my laptop, isn't connected by Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or some sort of other protocol that I probably wouldn't trust, just using these QR codes. It was magical to me. And so at that point, I had been blessed to step away from my forensic career, and I started interacting with a couple of the developers that were working on both the Spectre DIY and Spectre Desktop. And I started personally interacting with Michael Flaxman, and I also am a little bit of a 3D printing nerd. So I designed an enclosure for Spectre DIY, which before that, they didn't really have a way to hold these do-it-yourself electronic components together. So I designed a super simple enclosure that was open sourced in their repo, and gave more people access to this amazing tool. And as I was interacting with Michael Flaxman, he told me about an idea that he had to use a specific version of the Raspberry Pi, which a lot of people are familiar with Raspberry Pis as platforms. They're not great for nodes these days. I know some people still use them for nodes and they can work for that, but they're not ideal for nodes, but that's how most people are familiar with them. There's a smaller version of the Raspberry Pi single board computer, which is a little bit smaller than a credit card, which makes it ideal to be this little handheld computing device. But the special thing about this particular version of the Raspberry Pi was that it has no Wi-Fi and no Bluetooth. It doesn't have an RJ45 port, so you can't plug it into an internet source. So it's this naturally very isolated environment where you can be confident that you can create a private key or work with a private key without having it leak to a network or another computer. And he had the original idea of using this little Raspberry Pi Zero, is what the board is called, to create private keys. Actually, not to create private keys, to do a BIP39 lottery where you take randomly selected BIP39 seed words. You would type them into this little Raspberry Pi computer, and the last word of a BIP39 seed phrase is deterministic. So it is determined from the seed words that precede it, and it acts as a kind of checksum, so that if you type that seed phrase into a wallet or a computer, you should never do that, but for whatever reason, if you enter it into another device and you've made a mistake or written down one of the words wrong, or you've mistyped it, that last word is a checksum that will tell the device you've entered into to warn you something doesn't look right here. This seed phrase doesn't. And you want to obviously compute that checksum word in an offline environment, because you never want to put your Bitcoin seed words into a computer or a device that connects with the internet. So he had this idea to use Raspberry Pi Zero to create checksum words, to be able to create new keys in an offline, very secure way. So I love to tinker with things. I don't really have a background in programming, though I have taken a couple of classes. This was like in 2002. I took a class in Java back in the day. So I took his idea and I added a screen and some hand controls to the Raspberry Pi. And I watched Udemy videos for a week to learn enough Python to be dangerous. And I figured out how to make a proof of concept of this device that you could enter seed words into, and then it would tell you what the checksum word was that completed your seed phrase. And as I thought about this little device, it's kind of cool. What if I add, this little device cost me $18 to build. So that's like appealing to my inner cheapskate. And then I thought, what if I added a $7 camera to this device? Why couldn't it do the same thing as the Spectre DIY, this device I was so taken with and enamored with? And so that was the genesis for SeedSigner and how it came about. I was able to attach a camera and write enough horrible spaghetti code that I could show it off to other people. And then some other developers over time who understand Bitcoin and understand the value of what this device could do, thankfully started to collaborate with me and started to contribute their talents to what has grown into the SeedSigner project. The SeedSigner project is we are a volunteer open source software project. A lot of people see the logo or they see my Twitter profile or they hear about it and they think that SeedSigner is a company or it's a product, but at its heart, it is just a software project. And what it allows you to do, it's a software project that is targeted at a very specific hardware environment. And that hardware environment is one, a Raspberry Pi single board computer. We prefer the smaller 0 ones, but it also works with the full size Raspberry Pis. Two, it's a very specific LCD screen and controls. It's just a little 240 by 240 pixel screen, 3 buttons and a thumbstick. And then the third thing is the camera that I mentioned. And the camera is what facilitates that device's ability to take in information. And then the screen is what facilitates the device's ability to put out information. So the only way that this little device can communicate with the outside world is with the camera and the screen. There's no Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, NFC, or other wireless connectivity. There's no USB. There actually is USB connectivity on one of the USB ports, but on the Raspberry Pi Zero, there is another USB port. There's 2 ports. The second port is hardwired for power only, so you can even confidently plug in that board to your laptop computer and have solid assurances that there is no data running over that line. So those are the 3 core things that make up a SeedSigner. You obviously have to have a micro SD card that you load our software onto, but that is what the SeedSigner project. It is a software project that lets you build this little device that is a wonderful little environment to be able to create private keys, to also create the public versions of those private keys that you need to set up a wallet, and then to actually sign transactions in that same air-gapped fashion with QR codes that, for me, was so compelling early on.
Do you sell it as like a kit also, or everybody has to take the parts on their own, or is like a SeedSigner kit where you have everything in there and then you can plug it in yourself?
There is, that's a great question. The best way to acquire a SeedSigner is to build it yourself, because in addition to it being such a kick-ass little device I can't gush enough about the contributions that our developers have made, and we have an amazing UI UX designer who has given us a ton of perspective. So there is value to SeedSigner beyond it being something that you build yourself. But if you want to get the benefits of eliminating or heavily mitigating what I would call supply chain risk that is associated with other Bitcoin cold storage tools, the best path is to build it yourself. That said, in a way, SeedSigner is kind of a victim of its own success, because it is such a compelling user experience that even people who aren't willing to build it themselves would like to have one. So this kind of cottage industry has sprung up around the device, where there are people on 5 or 6 continents now building SeedSigners at a cottage scale sort of endeavor, who sell them to other people. And I just always remind people that because you're giving up that, you're mixing up some trust in that. So you really need to make sure you're buying it from a source that you trust. And if you have any concerns whatsoever, we're always a DIY project first, and it's really not that difficult to acquire the components yourself and build it yourself. There's still benefits to the device if you've given up that trust and let someone else build it for you. But the best way is to make it yourself.
I think if you go the length and do it with a SeedSigner, I think you can go the length and do it yourself. I think like if there's, but also like as I mentioned before with the friend, when you have, like, I also think that when you have Bitcoin and understand Bitcoin, you should do it the self-custody way. But we also have to be aware, and you kind of touched on that in the beginning with the hierarchy, the ladder, with different self-custody solutions. There's a learning curve to everything. Like, there are people are coming in Bitcoin, then they're learning about that, and hopefully they learn without pain. Most people learn with pain, but yeah, that's basically it.
And I encourage people to think of their cold storage journey as a journey and not a destination. Don't ever set up any hardware wallet or multi-sig setup or anything thinking it is going to be the last time you ever visit your cold storage. It's a journey and not a destination. So don't think it has to be absolutely, it needs to be secure, but don't think it has to be perfect, and don't think it has to be the setup that you're going to use for the rest of your life. Like, we all learn and grow, and the technology and innovations and frankly perspectives in cold storage change over time too. I think that before SeedSigner came along, there was this very ossified, starting to ossify view of cold storage, where it was just accepted practice that if you want to do cold storage, you go to a company that makes hardware wallets and you buy a hardware wallet, through a website or whatever, and you have it shipped to you, and then you let the hardware wallet tell you what the private key is, and you make sure to write down those words that represent the private key, and then you deposit your Bitcoin to the hardware wallet. And it took, I'm not the only person. I can't take credit for this. I stand on the shoulders of giants because, like I said, I first experienced this different path with Spectre. But it takes someone with a little bit different perspective who's not, I'm not a hardware security module guy. My background's in forensics, so I bring some different adversarial thinking to the larger cold storage debate. And it takes some of these different perspectives and innovative ways of thinking to move best practices forward collectively. And there's going to be things that move cold storage further beyond what we're doing. I'm very interested in what AnchorWatch and Liana and some of the other projects are doing with time locks. And I'm not sure that I call them degrading multi-sig setups, but as some of the people who are building those pointed out, that's not like the best word, because you don't want to think about your wallet as degrading. But these wallets where they can change over time if you should lose a key, in such a way that if you're willing to wait long enough, you're not going to lose your Bitcoin. And I can talk more about that, but it's not really my area of expertise. Again, I'm digressing and meandering, and I forget what your question was.
It's for me interesting to see so many different solutions, and I think it's also interesting to see how Bitcoin learning itself is always a never-ending story. Like, there's always you every year at the end of the year, I think, oh shit, how much did I learn last year about Bitcoin, just on Bitcoin and the touching points with Bitcoin, and what an idiot I was just 1 year ago. But this is good, I think. If you like go back in time and 1 year ago you were idiot, this means you got a little bit smarter this year. And in Bitcoin, there are a lot of different topics, a lot of different things. Like I have now my eighth podcast, and I just do it since December. So it's really started out with a daily podcast now, and every podcast has a different flair to it. Every podcast has some different topics to it. Obviously, there are similar schemes or similar patterns to it. But besides self-custody and SeedSigner and everything we talked now on the podcast, what are you currently looking at? Like, what are you currently learning in Bitcoin, looking into Bitcoin? What are like the things that you are now concerned with in the Bitcoin space?
Outside of what I think I have to offer in terms of perspectives on SeedSigner, I have to issue a disclaimer and say that my knowledge isn't perfect about any subject, even cold storage, but it's especially imperfect when we get into the protocol of Bitcoin, and I am admittedly the least technical person on the core SeedSigner team. So if I talk about anything else, please take it with a grain of salt. But in terms of what I think about, I am monitoring kind of the debate about CTV and thinking about the base chain, and does it really make sense for everybody in the world to be able to own a UTXO? Is that really possible given the technical limitations of Bitcoin and the key ingredients that make it a decentralized, censorship-resistant network? And everything in life is trade-offs. And so I was personally surprised at how the Taproot upgrade was leveraged to facilitate what I think we're experiencing. I can't speak for you, but what I consider as at worst a spam attack, and at best, just graffiti in the Bitcoin blockchain. Not a fan of all the ordinals and inscription stuff. And some people will even say, well, it was a known thing when we implemented Taproot that was possible. If it was known, I don't think it was widely known or widely understood, because I think if people had understood that this is where we were going to land as a result of that upgrade, I don't know that it would have gotten through as easily or at all eventually. So there are a lot of unintended consequences that can come into play. It's just a natural outgrowth of the game theory and growth in life. Like, we're growing as a Bitcoin ecosystem. You just mentioned that you feel like a year or two ago there were things you don't understand, and you think that, how could I not have understood it? But it's the natural progression of learning and growth, and we're still learning how to understand and use this thing called Bitcoin. So I'm thinking about protocol ossification. Should Bitcoin go into some sort of maintenance mode, and any sort of new innovations, we need to figure out how to implement those on side chains or on layer 2s or adjacent platforms, or whatever you want to call those. I think that's a legitimate debate that can be had. And a lot of people who are proponents of CTV will say, like, ossification is death and you're ignorant. And there can be arguments made that the Bitcoin protocol should continue to grow and evolve, but I don't think those arguments should be made in a kind of hostage-taking way where people say, like, if we don't change things, it's going to be choose your custodian. That's going to be only a small, so the argument I've heard is that if we don't change things right now, only 1% of 1% of the world is going to actually be able to hold a UTXO, and for everyone else, it's going to be choose your custodian. I think that's kind of like a rhetorical mechanism that people use to incite urgency and communicate the need for action, when in truth, this is not going to be a binary outcome. We're not going to wake up next month and suddenly UTXO ownership is impractical for anyone but Michael Saylor and BlackRock. Like, that's not going to happen next month. This is going to be a slow progression where over time fees grow up. And I don't think that's a bad thing for fees to go up. They're definitely going to go up in nominal terms, but they're also going to go up, I think, in Bitcoin terms over time. And I think that's okay. But we need to think carefully about the problem we're trying to solve and the proposals that are being proposed and where those solutions make sense to be implemented. I think that Blockstream's Liquid, I think, gets a lot of undeserved shade as a network or as a tool. And ultimately, it's a tool. You trade off different things. I'm not a Blockstream shill. They don't pay me to talk about it, but it's a tool with different security assurances that may make sense for some people and may not make sense for other people. I have to tell you that, like, if I get to a point where I am priced out of holding UTXOs on the main chain, the Blockstream Federation, the Liquid Federation, I guess I should say, will still offer me the opportunity to hold UTXOs probably in a multi-sig context where the keys can stay offline and I can use them in the same kind of air-gapped context that I use Bitcoin on the main chain right now. Will that trade-off make sense? Well, I have concerns that the Federation might rug me. Like, that's all stuff I have to evaluate. Fediments, I admittedly know very little about Fediments. There is rug pull risk, as I understand it, that's associated with them. But if it's something that's organized in your community and you know the players that are involved and you trust them, it sounds like it can absolutely be a great model to collaboratively transact with Bitcoin and store some amount of Bitcoin on long term. This virtual UTXOs, I'm even more of a fish out of water on there. I don't understand how all that works. I think the tools are still yet to be built, and as the tools, are built as proof of concepts, maybe it will become apparent that this is too obscured and not viable from a UI UX perspective, or maybe it'll be proven that it's very compelling and that this is a direction that Bitcoin. I don't think we need to be in a hurry to get anywhere in terms of scaling Bitcoin to make sure as many people as possible have access to the seizure resistant, permissionless, trustless, hard to seize, hard to dilute aspect of the main chain. I want to get as many people into that lifeboat as we can, and that's why I wake up every day trying to tell people about SeedSigner, because there are parts of the world where if you want to custody your private keys offline, it's hard to get a hardware wallet. There's there are places in the Middle East, I've interacted with people there, who the only way to buy a hardware wallet is through a black market source where it's being resold. Like, who wants to buy a security critical Bitcoin tool from a black market source where you don't know, what's been done with it before it's made it into your hands? Or people in, it's a political hot button issue, but there's a Bitcoiner in Moscow who I've privately been in touch with, who says that as a result of the Ukraine war sanctions, because most hardware wallets are made in countries that are on the Ukraine side, there are commercial electronics restrictions. And even if they want to buy hardware wallets in Russia, they can't, because most of them aren't allowed to be shipped to Russia except in a kind of smuggled black market kind of context. So they are purchasing. This guy I talked to is buying hundreds of Raspberry Pi Zeros, and he's teaching people at meetups in and around that area how to use SeedSigners, because that's what they can get, and that's what works for them. So it's a complicated world out there. There's a lot to think about. Bitcoin's going to grow and mutate, and we'll figure it out as we go.
Yeah, and I think this is the point of Bitcoin, and I think this is also like a really good ending point for the podcast, that Bitcoin is absolutely a community thing. Like, we need the community exchange. We need the things like. So, like, I'm amazed how many people outside of Bitcoin still think it's like a payment app, something like that, right. With like some CEO on top of it, and it's just not that. It's more like a protocol. But before we get into the let's now get in the end routine. The end routine of our podcast is the previous guest is asking a question for next guest without knowing who is the next guest. Okay. Which is really, really interesting. It's like kind of the blockchain thing where like all the episodes are like a little bit connected with each other. And the last guest was actually a Guy Swan. I just looked at it, and he asked you, without giving any further context to the question, what's the most important thing?
Truth. Truth is the most important thing. The first word that came to my mind is I'm a Christian. That love is the most important thing, but even love, I think, is an outgrowth of truth and seeing reality for what it is. Truth. I don't know if your guests usually elaborate on that, but that's my answer.
It depends. Like sometimes it's like the end of the podcast and it's like 1 minute and it's off. And sometimes it can go on for like another 10, 15 minutes.
I don't want to digress to that degree. So I'm just going to leave it at truth.
Yes. And I think also like, as you said, love is the first thing that comes through. I think love is only possible if you have truth. So truth is the more fundamental thing. And, I think also like the more important thing than in general. So,
that statement.
Yeah. Thank you, Seyr, for being on. Thank you for taking the time and speaking here to us. It was a pleasure. It was really, really cool to pick your brain and see where you're on the Bitcoin journey. Where can people, when they now have questions about your statements, when they have questions about the SeedSigner, when they want to reach out to you for different reasons, where can they reach you? Where can they ask you questions?
For better or worse, the widest audience I probably have is on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is @SeedSigner on Twitter. I'm also happy to be engaged on Nostr. It didn't come up in our conversation, but I think Nostr is a very important freedom tool. And I have an account there. If you search for SeedSigner on Nostr, you will notice that we run our own verification. I don't even know what it's. There's, I'm sure, a NIP associated with it, but through our marquee website, seedsigner.com, you will find my profile as well as a small number of other profiles that are vouched for through seedsigner.com as being the official version of that account. And I've already mentioned now that seedsigner.com is a thing. We were lucky to get that domain because SeedSigner wasn't a thing before our project sprang up. So that's another good place to learn about our project. We have a very active Telegram community of users who very generously are willing to answer questions, and you can meet and interact with our developers there. If you're considering building a SeedSigner and you have questions about where to get the device or how to put it together, if you have one that you put together or bought and you have questions about how to use it, it's another great resource for that. There's a link to the Telegram community. I periodically tweet it out, and it's also on our websites. What else am I supposed to talk about? I think that's all. I think, those are the primary ways to engage with what we're doing. You can TLDR SeedSigner, as we have this amazing permissionless, trustless open source money with Bitcoin. And to use Bitcoin as a long-term savings tool, we think that you should have an equally trust minimized, permissionless, open source signing device to be able to save with Bitcoin long term. So that's what I'll close with.
Perfect. Thank you for taking the time, Seyr.
Absolute welcome. It was a pleasure to meet and talk with you.